So hi everyone, today is our first MESA Colloquium of the spring semester, and our speaker today is Dr. Dr. Reinholz. He's the Assistant Professor of Math Education at San Diego State University. He's a co-founder of the Access Network and co-developer of the Equip tool, which we'll probably hear about in today's talk. And broadly speaking, Dr. Reinholz's research focuses on creating tools for educational transformation, and as well as to improve equity and mitigate systemic oppression. And his commitment and work in the area of departmental change is truly fascinating. For example, last year, a book that he co-authored with a big team on facilitating change in higher education came out, which looks really exciting. Love to take a look at it sometime soon, if I have time. So his commitment, So in today's talk, we're gonna have an exciting opportunity to learn more about his experiences with promoting racial and gender justice in undergraduate math education. And so Dr. Dr. Reinholz, what role do data play?
Good question. Okay, hey everyone, thanks so much for having me. It's great to meet you all. Oh, can I have screen sharing? I do have some slides, but I hope, we have a relatively small group. I also hope we can have a conversation and not just me talking, because I know that's not that exciting. Let's try to make space to do that too throughout the time that we have here together. So very quickly, so I'm at San Diego State, and I just went up for tenure, so I'm excited to clear that milestone soon, hopefully. But right now, just jazzed to be here and to share some of the work with you all. So let's get into it. So really, today I kind of want to focus on three areas, thinking about our own positioning and how that plays out in the classroom. How does that relate to this concept of bias that folks are probably hearing all the time in the news everywhere? And of course, bias is only a part of it. And then what role can data play for us to think about transforming our own practices, or a lot of times in my case, it's doing professional development with others to support them around their teaching in sort of a partnership fashion. Let's get into it. So just first, a little bit about me. I know I walk in the room, people are like, here's another white guy. Okay, what are they going to say? What's going on with regards to equity? And I think the point here is, we have an immediate gut impression when we see somebody, just sort of based on what's visible. Then there's also a lot of things that might be underneath the surface that we don't see. I'm a high school dropout. I have multiple disabilities. And so those things actually factor in a lot to how I see the work and how I bring myself into the work. And you can probably see the drums in the background. And so the question is, okay, we're whole people when we walk into the classroom, but I think sometimes there's this expectation or this feeling in math world that those things don't matter. And I think on the contrary, those things matter a lot, as many of you know. But so just to ground that, I think we don't need to get into great depth around what disability justice is, but just given my own position, that's kind of the lens. It's an intersectional lens, thinking about disability, race, gender, how all these things come together. And that's the place that I come to when I'm looking at this work. So that gives you a little bit about where I'm coming from. And so super quick, see, interactive already. Just drop in the chat if just a minute. Do you see places where, maybe your own identities, you bring that into your teaching, if you're teaching, or maybe into the classroom, or, your students? How does that matter? How does that show up when we're interacting in these spaces? It could be math, it could be other spaces too, whatever feels appropriate. And then I'll do the super awkward wait time, so you can all have some time to respond, and I'll get in a few more steps while you're doing that. And this, I mean, I think this question can show up in profound ways, and it can also be very simple things like, I have a dog and I love my dog and they're on all of my slides, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of different facets to who we are and how that shows up in our teaching. Yeah, and so I'll read some of these out as they come in. So Alvina, I hope I got your name right. Remembering who you are, particularly invisible identities, can make you more sensitive to who your students are. Haida, being, oh, now I can't even keep up. They're too fast. But being concerned, students might just see you as Asian and assume that you're good at math. Thinking about disability, how does that affect teaching? James, as an upper class white male, how does that shape your purpose of mathematics? Sarah, biases as a Korean American immigrant, how does that show up in your interactions as a teacher? Yeah, so thanks, and feel free to just drop more things in there. And I think I noticed the one that folks didn't do is sort of thinking about students, right? But every student that we have in our classrooms also has this complex multitude of identities, some of them visible, some of them not visible. And I think a lot of times we don't pay a lot of attention to those things in our teaching. And so that means it can sometimes be this one size fits all, but we actually have a huge diversity in students in our classrooms. And so thinking about how our students see us, as sort of as Aida was getting to, right? I think the first impression is really what are the groups in society that we seem to belong to. But then also, you know, we're mathematicians. We're members of whatever institution we be a part of. We might remind them of experiences they had in the past. And then I think sort of as we unpeel all of those layers, only through a lot of work and trust and relationship building do we become individuals, right? And I think part of that is also in what ways do we bring our identities? In what ways do we make that explicit? In a way that our students also can get to know us authentically and not just as a caricature of some mathematician in some group. I have to talk about whiteness if we're going to talk about equity in mathematics, because racial inequity is a huge issue in terms of the disparities that we look at, disparities in human experiences in math. And I think really the takeaway point for me is when we think about whiteness and we think about this conversation, so I work with a lot of white teachers, a lot of white faculty, is just remembering the origins and really recognizing that, you know, many hundreds of years ago, there was sort of this effort to basically lump all of these very diverse peoples in the African subcontinent into a category of blackness, right? This category never existed. There were people of different nations, of different cultures, and sort of this collective othering was used as a way to justify enslavement. And it was only through this collective othering that this concept of whiteness was created. And that's been a fluid concept over time, right? Who counts as white, who counts as white in what context changes. But fundamentally, it's about power, right? And economic power and other forms of power. And so when we think about mathematical culture and sort of those connections to whiteness, we have to recognize those historical roots. I think especially for white folks who are teaching, it's really important to be cognizant of that history and that positioning, and what do we do to actually push back against that and dismantle it. So some of you may have seen this graphic, some of you may have not. I'm not going to talk through all of it, but we can look at this is these facets of white supremacy culture or dominant white culture and how we see them play out. And I think if you take a minute, take the recording and just pause it, you check off academia and these characteristics, or mathematics and these characteristics, it's scary what the level of alignment is, right? And so I think we're really operating in sort of this white dominant cultural space in mathematics and mathematics education. And so then the question is, in what ways do we disrupt that? In what ways do we perpetuate that on purpose, inadvertently? And how do we think about those things? And what impact does it have on our students? And so really for me, the impact on our students is one of the things I'm quite concerned about. So we're going to do a couple little quizzes, thought experiments, if you will. So I hope you're ready to go. So I'm going to show you a word, and I just want you to think of the first picture that comes to mind when you read that word. It's a mathematician, and there was recently a study, not recent, about 10 years ago now, I think, where some students in 7 or 8 countries around the world, predominantly white countries, were asked to draw a mathematician, and they drew pictures like this, right? And so we sort of see these stereotypes of not only white masculinity, but violence, right? Sort of like hitting the student on the arms. One of the teachers has a gun. Like I think it's pretty disturbing that these are the images that like middle school students bring to mind when they think about mathematics. And it makes me reflect as a mathematician and a math educator, like, how are we going so terribly wrong in the work that we're doing? So we have these stereotypes, and rarely, not never, but these are not necessarily, here's some other mathematicians, some wonderful mathematicians that may not immediately come to mind when you ask somebody to draw a mathematician. And I think that's something that we need to problematize and need to shift away from. So the point is we have these stereotypes, right? Sort of these biases around what society tells us a mathematician looks like. And generally these play out in ways that are subconscious, that we're not thinking about, but they impact our actions anyway. So just to dig into implicit bias, here's a little test for you. Let's see if you can pass. I'm going to show you, some of you may have done this. I'm going to show you some words that have some colors. And I want you to just say, you can say it out loud, you're on mute to yourself, what the colors are, but not the words. And we're going to do this 2 times. So we have blue, yellow, red, purple, black. Okay. So that was the first time. Now we're going to do it the second time, and I want you to see, does it feel easier or harder than the first time we did it? I'm assuming that was going to be harder for everybody. And the amazing thing about this test is that no matter how many times you've done it, you still can't pass it. The second one is still always harder, and that's because of the way that our minds work. All of these things are subconscious. We have these very strong associations here between a particular word and a particular color. And so this is implicit, right? This is kind of happening below the surface, and a lot of our thinking and a lot of the way our minds work is that way. And it's the same way when we think about these really kind of problematic, racist, masculine, sexist stereotypes about mathematics. Even when we, consciously disagree with those and find them very problematic, they can still play out in our teaching. They can still play out in our classrooms in sort of these unexpected ways without that extra effort to really be aware of how they could play out and to counteract that or make sure it doesn't happen. And so that's where, in my work, the data comes into play. I just want to emphasize, I think of implicit bias as a symptom. Like there's a lot of, university efforts or just around the world, we're just going to cure bias, just give another diversity training and everything is fixed. I think that's pretty short-sighted and problematic. But I think the concept can be useful when we use that as a starting point to get into these larger systems of oppression. If it's patriarchy or anti-Blackness or ableism or whatever it might be, implicit bias can help us see how that shows up. It can help us start to have those conversations with folks to do more of that dismantling work. So before talking about that, I want to just give like 2 quick vignettes of how this can play out for students. So the first one is from a student That was in a class I taught a number of years ago, Sam. So he was Latino. He had an indigenous heritage, and he was just coming back to school after being in the military for 20 years. So let's go to his story. So he talks about, I grew up in South Central LA in the 80s. My sister was a grade above me, and she was always working on her math homework. After a year of shoulder monstering her, which is like the favorite term that I've ever read, I realized that I enjoyed math. Unfortunately, for some reason, I was put in English as second language classes, although my first language was in fact English. Right, so here we see these implicit biases. We see this assumptions being made about the student simply because of the way that he looked. And so he continues the story. In 5th grade, a math teacher asked me why I was not taking the same classes as my sister. I replied that in the classes I am taking, they do not give challenging work because we Latinos would never be able to grasp complex math. My teacher pulled me, so we see this bias, this sort of own negative bias against himself that's already been internalized. He's a 5th grade student, right? This stuff happens early, it's pervasive, it's pernicious. So the teacher pulls him aside. Do you know where your ancestors came from? Tells me the contributions of the Maya. After that conversation, I was moved to a regular math class, more like my sister's, but I still wanted to know more about math. 2 months later, I applied for math club, and I was the club member of the month for 3 months straight. Right, so we see Sam is back on track with math, excited, motivated, engaged, seeing himself in the math again. Comes later to high school, fell out of love with math when I took an AP calculus class my senior year. Teacher was more worried about my position on the football field. Said athletes did not make good mathematicians because sports don't require brains. At that time, it was full of hormones and let myself get convinced I was not going to do well in it, and I quit. And so there's more to the story, but he joins the Marines. 20 years later, he's back studying engineering, winds up into my class, and I'm just amazed to kind of talk with him and learn more from him and about his story. But you can see, right, on the earlier slide, John Urschel, former NFL player turned mathematician, obviously breaking that stereotype. What does it mean when we can challenge those stereotypes rather than kind of doing these oppressive things to our students? So here's Sam. Sam's story is far too common. I'm actually sure many of you probably have similar stories in your own experiences, but all of us are here nonetheless. And so some of you may know Robin Wilson. Some of you may, he's a good friend of mine and a colleague. He also has a chapter in Living Proof, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend. But he has this short article, A View of Mathematics Behind the Veil. And he just talks about his experiences as what it was like as a Black mathematician and sort of the assumptions made about him, the opportunities that weren't made available. And it, sure, he's a professor, but where could he be, if he actually had all those opportunities along the journey? None of us can really say, right? So I think it's a really powerful piece. I highly recommend it. But these are just like, when we think about Sam's story, when you read Robin's story, it's like individual instances of kind of one problematic statement from one teacher in one grade, right? It doesn't, and the things are common, but it can just be one thing that's so impactful. And so how do we not make those things happen to our students? So thinking more broadly about bias, it plays out in a lot of ways. It could be what we expect of our students. It could be microaggressions in a class. When we have a discussion, who do we call on? What do we ask them? And what do we use in terms of curriculum? So we're going to dig a little bit more into really the discussion piece, is where a lot of my work has focused. Before that, I'm going to catch my breath and just ask folks, to the extent that you feel comfortable, and we can, I think, as we get some of the stuff out in the chat, it will also be nice too to just like talk about things, later when we have a lot of discussion time. But do you see these things playing out in your own classrooms? Do you have experiences or experiences of your students where we actually see this stuff happening in the math classroom? now I have a chance to read the rest of the chat, so I'm excited because it looks like there's some awesome stuff in there. I guess I'll read a few. Maybe it will be helpful for the sake of the recording too. But Alvina sharing, I've had students assume that I'm not their teacher. That's something I've heard from other colleagues of color on my campus. It's very problematic, and it's not something that happens to people who are white and coded as masculine typically, even when we're young. Students partnering with other students of the same race or gender. So I think that's an interesting one. There's a lot to unpack in terms of what are students comfortable with, what is actually most beneficial for students, and maybe that is actually beneficial in some cases, and maybe some cases mixing things up is also helpful. Jenna sharing teaching at a school where the population was 50-50 Black and white. But we have sort of this mismatch in the way students are tracked, right, to honors classes or AP classes and other classes. And so I'm not going to read the other ones. You can come back to them later. But I think what we see is a lot of like structural issues like tracking or bias or racism then play out in these very interpersonal ways in the classroom space. And so the question is, so this is where really a lot of my research has focused over the last 7 years, is how do we uncover those biases, and then how do we do things about them? So a lot of my work has been with white teachers, not only, but also recognizing that like in K-12 schools, I think like 75% of teachers are white women. It might not be quite that high, but it's very high, right? And so that's a whole nother issue to just recognize sort of the mismatch between who's teaching and the students that we're teaching and all the problems that come along with that. So maybe we can dive into that more too. But thinking about our own biases. So how do we uncover those? So this is where, as Aida talked about, equip is one approach that my colleague Niril Shah and I have been working on for about 7 years. So Niril and I knew each other back in grad school when we were at Berkeley. And all of his work focused on sort of racial narratives, critical race theory, these types of things in classrooms. And I had done a lot of design work also around equity. And so we sort of came together and asked, like, can we build something that helps research, but also just has an impact for teachers, for professors, for students in their classrooms like now? Because we just knew that we didn't want to just write articles and like talk to other academics. That it was really important for us to actually try to give students better experiences and try to help like address some of these pressing issues that happen in classrooms. And so I'm just going to share a little bit about what we've done. But first, the tool. So the tool is open source. It's 100% free. You can just pull up that website and you can log on, you can build an account, you can start doing it today if you got really motivated after the talk. And really our goal is to work with, support, and empower teachers. We're not evaluating, we're not judging teachers, but we want to give them quantitative analytics on participation patterns. Because this is one of the things that we know from a lot of research. We know how that's gendered. We know how it's racialized in who teachers call on, what types of questions they ask, and also when we look at the sort of that masculine environment, like which students feel comfortable speaking up when a teacher just asks a question of the whole class without using any kind of discourse strategies or not doing anything to mitigate these systemic factors. So really what we try to understand is the who question. And that's what I think is very different from most of the observation tools out there that try to tell you something about the class as a whole, as though the whole class has the same experience, which we know is certainly not true. And so we're not trying to say all students experience this. We're trying to say, when we look at different students in the class, what can we learn about their experiences? It's a quantitative measure. It's designed to be scalable. There's obviously a lot of things we miss. We try to capture the low-hanging fruit, and we try to also recognize that from a research perspective, this is something that we use with other data sources, qualitative, whatever it might be. The quantitative analytics don't tell us everything, but they can be pretty telling in cases. Everything is customizable to whoever we're working with. So if a teacher says they want to focus on wait time, or they want to focus on this discourse move, or they want to focus on question types, we customize equip to look at that. Depending on their context, maybe, it could be looking at race and gender. A lot of times we do. We were in like a Catholic school one time. And so what about Catholic students versus non-Catholic students? Or, if you were in an HBCU, how would you think about racism or like race or colorism or other things a little bit differently? So no matter where we are, we try to like understand what might be some of the hierarchies and how are those tied to social identities? So we take those two things together, what we want to code and sort of the social markers, the demographic characteristics. Then we get analytics after coding. This is what the app looks like. We're going to set up a classroom, basically like a seating chart. We add information about the students. And then when we're coding, we just have this interface up. Every time a student talks, we're going to click on their name and code something about that particular contribution. And so then at the end of the day, we're going to have a sort of running log of different students and their type of participation they had. And then we can generate analytics. And so the app will do that automatically for you. If you click on that, you can just generate a lot of different types. I'm just going to show you a few. So this is the heat map. So we could, break things up by race and look at individual students. If you click on the individual students, it will also tell you more about them. We can look at things, how they change over time for different demographic groups. We can look at, maybe we're doing breakouts with small groups. And so we just want to focus on those 3 students at a time. So there's a lot of different ways, but what we're trying to do is get data in front of instructors, recognizing that like most folks are not really thinking about this when they're teaching math. If you walk up to a random faculty member and you ask them, how does race matter in your classroom? They'll probably say, I don't know, I treat all students the same. Or maybe they even do recognize that it matters. But, I've asked a lot of people, okay, that race and gender matter in your classroom. How does that impact your teaching? What do you actually do to teach for racial and gender equity? And that's the question that, very rarely can people answer in a concrete way. And so that's what we're trying to bridge that gap. Maybe there's some awareness, maybe there's some interest, but lack of practical skills or strategies to do that. And so we use the data as a starting point because we know, working with a lot of teachers, especially white teachers, without the data, the conversations very quickly go to this general idea of equity. And we lose sight of race, we lose sight of gender, like all those things just like, well, some of my kids are shy, some of them are confident. And like these sort of student level descriptors come in, and then we're missing the picture. We're missing like the systemic nature of what's actually happening. So that starts as a tool to build awareness. And what type of awareness can we build? I want to share a little bit from some of our studies. And I'm happy to share papers from anything. But so here's one of the earlier studies we did looking at undergraduate geometry, and this was purely focused on gender, basically as a side effect of the data that was collected. This is a secondary data analysis. So there were 5 cameras in this room, and it was a very inquiry-based classroom, lots of group work, whole class discussions. And so this allowed us to track these student groups all the way through in their small groups, but also what was happening in whole class. And then the cool thing was the group cameras were still going during the whole class discussions. So we actually picked up all of the side conversations at the tables while the main discussion was going on. And so we ended up coding about 3,000 contributions across just a sample of 6 tasks. So we didn't do all of them. And we wanted to look at what was happening in these different settings. How was that gendered? And this was, this was ostensibly taught by someone who would be considered a very good math teacher by math education standards, general reform mathematics, inquiry, that type of thing. And so what we found, this is just quantitative. You can just see in terms of the overall public talk in the whole class discussion, it was totally dominated by men. And so this is basically what the instructor saw, right? There's like, oh, I have all these guys in my class and they're answering all these questions. But what's notable, if you look at the side talk, so this is happening in parallel during the whole class discussions, it's pretty gender balanced. And I'm not I don't have the things in here, but there's a bunch of examples where there's actually conversations where you have 2 women at one of these tables and they've figured out how to do this projection. The rest of the class is just kind of stumbling with it, but it never comes out. It never comes out in the whole class discussion because the space wasn't created there. So we have these really fascinating things where the women in these groups have kind of figured it out, but it's not becoming public. What's going on in this environment? And similarly, we see that in the groups, although everything in the groups isn't rosy, as I'll share also. If we look actually at the strategies the instructor was using in the whole class, they weren't really using strategies. They just said, who has an answer? Someone tell me about this. And it was always would be almost every time the first student raising their hand was a man in the class. Even if they didn't know the answer, even if they didn't have a great explanation, you got to listen to me, right? And so here we see the instructor didn't have strategies to avoid that, or didn't have a way to be conscious of that. I think it's probably something they weren't aware of, right? And so here's a very well-intentioned teacher, but we see this playing out in a way that's marginalizing for women in the classroom simply because of lack of awareness. But these are strategies that are learnable, right? And this instructor could use. Before you walk away with the idea that okay, just do small groups, everything is fixed. We observe a ton of really, really sexist, super problematic stuff in the groups. And so content warning around this one. But just to share examples of how this would play out is the students are working on a proof. Isabel's do this one. Da 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 dot dot dot. They're going through the proof. We can see Carl's oh, he doesn't listen to girls. And then Raul's what did I say in the other class? Yeah, I can't hear her when she's in the kitchen. These aren't collinear, right? So we see these super sexist, problematic tropes coming in mid-sentence with math in this really bizarre, not bizarre, but very problematic way. And there's many, many, many episodes of how this happens, right? I mean, you can even see the beginning comments Carla's oh, he doesn't listen to girls, because this is not the first time this kind of thing is happening in the classroom. But there's also from my perspective, I don't think the instructor had any awareness that any of this was happening, right? So there's all these ways that we see gender playing out in the classroom, and the instructor doesn't know what's going on. So what could we do if we were actually doing professional development? We actually had data to be able to share some of this so that there could be intentional changes in practice. And so that's what I want to give a couple examples of. So with Equip, we've done a number of studies that are just like research studies looking at things like this. But really what we wanted to move towards is giving data to faculty or teachers and saying, okay, we have the data, this is what's going on. Let's make a game plan to do something differently because this is not okay. This is not how we want our classrooms to look. So what happens when we give that data? I'm going to give 3 examples. So this is an example from a middle school teacher that we worked with. And so their classroom was interesting because if you looked on the whole, if you were looking at the way that sort of like participation broke down for different racial groups, the Black students actually had a very high level of participation, like I think higher than any of the other groups. And so like, you know, you could just kind of first pass like, oh, that's great, that's equitable, but it really wasn't, because when you dug one step deeper, you would see that this teacher kept asking these very low level questions. You know, this is like an algebra class, and he's asking the Black boys in his class to do arithmetic, for example, right? And so when we started to unpack this, he realized that he was using this more as like a disciplinary technique to manage participation. And this said a lot about the assumptions, sort of the faulty assumptions he was making about his students. He's like, I have this group of students, I think they might be disruptive. I'm going to give them these softball questions. That's very different from thinking, I have this group of students, they have amazing contributions that I can't wait to get out, and I'm going to ask the questions to get those out, right? And so here was the case where once this teacher got data on their own teaching, they were able to reflect on and see this sort of problematic bias, this kind of really horrible way of viewing some of their students, and reflect on that and say, oh, wow, okay, that's a problem. I need to change that. I need to do something different in my teaching, right? But if they didn't have the data, they wouldn't have seen what they were doing, and they wouldn't have been able to build this awareness, because the patterns are very subtle. It looked like the Black students in his class were participating, but he wasn't giving them meaningful participation opportunities. So that's one instance where we can see the data help uncover these things with teachers. Here's another example. This is another middle school one. But there was a particular teacher who had 2 Latinas in his class who were just not really participating much. And this particular classroom was a little bit bizarre because there was like a really big table in the middle and then some kind of funky desks on the side. And so like the students in the middle were kind of like the focal students, right? If you think about like the front row kind of gets all the attention. And so basically after seeing this pattern, the teacher just did 2 things. They changed the seating chart, brought these 2 Latinas into the middle table, and then also started intentionally putting in their lesson plans. They knew there were places where they were going to engage the students, and they wanted to remind themselves, I want to think about what some of these particular students are doing and whether or not I've been engaging them. And so these were 2 strategies. I mean, these are like as basic as they come, right? Super easy. I think any teacher could do this pretty easily. And then when you looked at the participation, like throughout the rest of the semester, those 2 students were very engaged. They were solving lots of problems publicly. You know, a huge shift in what we could see in the data, with just a small bit of awareness and a small change in practice. Here's the third one, which I'm just going to read. So this comes from an undergrad math professor, and it's a little bit long. But this was a study that we did over a course of a semester, and then this was actually written, it comes as a reflection a year later. And so the instructor says, what I was surprised to find was that the data I received said much more about me and my own teaching than it did about any of my students. The project helped me see that I have more control than I previously admitted about who participated in the classroom and how. My experience with Equip helped change the focus of my teaching from thinking about what I was going to do next mathematically to focusing on who was going to participate next in the classroom and how to build from their contribution. The power dynamics around student participation in whole class discussions is very complex, and student identities influence their participation in this setting. even now, more than a year after the original study took place, I'm finding I'm still changing my teaching practices because I now have a new way of looking at my teaching. And so this is one of the things that we're trying to aim is really give a different approach, because we might not be able to give data every semester, but if we can build that type of awareness, I know like personally, every time I go to conferences, I'm like equipping the Q&A sessions and other stuff. And I'm always like, oh my God, it's the same patterns. They're horrible. Like, why can't we use some kind of strategies to not have the same thing happen every time? But you know, it's like the first person will be like, not always white guy, but mostly, I'm gonna have a 2-minute response that like is not a question, but just tells you about my research and why I should have been the speaker. And then we sort of see these tropes play out in the Q&A sessions. And so I think the patterns come across in a lot of settings. But at least what we've found so far is that giving the data to teachers in a math classroom can build a lot of awareness and build an opportunity for a change in practice. And so we actually have time to talk. Maybe we don't need to do this, but I'll just give you a minute before we go into like discussion, just to think about are there things that you want to take, any ideas from this to maybe take forward? And then, yeah, I'm glad that we have lots of time to talk. So let's, you know, just talk about what you all are working on and interested in, and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you. Cool. And I think folks can take it or leave that action item step. But I'd love to just chat with you all. And also, Aida and James, I don't know, I know you're recording at some point. If you want to not record because people might feel more comfortable talking,
I was just gonna say, why don't we wrap up the recorded part of the session so that we can feel very open and safe space to contribute to the discussion. So I'm going to stop the recording.